Okay, hello, and welcome to this eSchool News webinar, Dyslexia and Instructional Equity, a conversation for school administrators. My name is Kevin Hogan. I am the content director for eSchool News, and I'm happy you're joining us today for what I know will be a very insightful and important conversation. This event is brought to you by Lexia, a Cambium learning group company. Lexia is the structured literacy expert. For nearly 40 years, the company has focused solely on literacy and today provides science of reading-based solutions for both students and educators. With robust offerings for differentiated instruction, personalized learning, assessment, and professional learning, Lexia helps more learners read, write, and speak with confidence. For more information, visit lexialearning.com. Now, before we get into our conversation, I'd like to take a minute to go over some of the features of the platform that we're using here for this webinar. The event is being recorded, so you don't have to worry about missing a thing. Within a few days, you'll receive an email message that contains a link to the recorded webinar, along with a PDF of the slides. So if you have a question or a comment for us, there's a chat function that you can launch. Please feel free to use this to engage both of our panelists. I think it really kind of helps in the conversations to know what the audience is looking for. Also, if you have a technical question, the eSchool News team can respond to it there as well. So with these housekeeping items out of the way, let's get started with some conversation and some introductions. Joining us today is Dr. David Herford. He is the Executive Director at the Center for Reading and the founder and manager of CARD Inc. That is a nonprofit dedicated to assisting individuals with dyslexia to become competent readers. He is the executive editor of Perspectives on Language and Literacy, which is a journal of the International Dyslexia Association. He has presented at many regional, national, and international conferences and has published articles in the area of dyslexia, reading difficulties, the prevention of reading failure, and other educational issues. Early in his career, he was the recipient of the Spencer Fellowship from the National Academy of Education, which allowed him to dedicate his efforts toward the prevention, identification, and intervention of reading difficulties, which resulted in a reading curriculum designed to prevent reading difficulties in kindergarten, it's called Secret Codes, and first grade, Advanced Codes. The Center for Reading and CARD uses his identification and remediation strategies to provide high quality and accurate assessments and successful interventions for children and adults who have dyslexia and reading difficulties. Doctor, thanks so much for joining us. What do you do after lunch, right?
Yeah, thank
So
you.
We're also thrilled to welcome Octavia Gray Essex. She's the Senior Education Advocate at Lexia. Octavia is a literacy advocate skilled in educational leadership, curriculum development, professional learning design, and instructional support around the shifts, principles, and fundamentals of the science of reading. She joined Lexia Learning in June of 2023 with 17 years experience of Texas public school education, where she served as a kindergarten teacher, first grade teacher, data analyst, a testing coordinator, elementary literacy specialist, assistant principal, and K-12 district literacy coordinator. In her role as senior education advisor, she continues to employ her passion for ensuring effective and equitable instructional practices to improve outcomes for all students. Her subject matter expertise and thought partnership are often used to bridge theory to practice for large-scale implementation of structured literacy practices. Octavia is currently pursuing a doctorate of education in curriculum instruction at Kansas State University, where she also serves as a K-State College of Education graduate teaching fellow. She is a member of the Literacy Research Association, Association of Literacy, sorry, I got my acronyms wrong here, Literacy Educators and Researchers, International Literacy Association, and Texas Association of Literacy Educators. Again, just, you're not that busy either, Octavia, obviously. So I want to thank you both, obviously, very busy people, to be able to take your time and share your insights and expertise with our audience here today. One other question actually is going to be for the audience themselves. Chris, if you could launch the poll, we just wanted to ask a question of you to help our panelists kind of see who is listening today and who's going to join us in the conversation. So what is your role in education? Are you a district administrator, school administrator, curriculum coordinator, teacher? Are you in higher ed? Other? And maybe we should have had a circle for some of the above or all the above. I know depending on the district or the school, that could be one of many different folks, right? So while we wait for our audience to come back with their results, we might as well get into the weeds, David and Octavia. Maybe we'll just kind of go right at it. Let's talk a little bit about the systemic challenges that schools face in providing effective inclusion instruction for students with dyslexia. I know, this is an issue that has been as old as education itself, but maybe talk about it in the current state of play of where we are in K-12 education. And Doctor, maybe I'll put you on the hot seat first.
Well, thank you. Firstly, I want to say it's great to be here. And I wanted to say thank you for all of you who are here who are educators. We can't solve this problem without you, and we need you. And right now, there are an awful lot of people who are deciding not to go into education, and our culture and our way of life depend on you. Because if we don't have individuals who are teaching kids how to read and how to think and how to get along with each other, that's a major problem. So, I hope that anyone who's listening who can help with the issue of getting people to get interested in education, do so, because it's really obviously super important. But for me, the major issue today, I think, we have people who are interested in education. We have people who want to be teachers who their heart has always been to help kids, learn. And, the major problem has been essentially that we haven't been teaching the science of reading. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time in the next question kind of answering, what the science of reading is, because a lot of people don't get that. They think it's some kind of curriculum or this notion of what, some conspiracy theories, and it just isn't. So I want to talk a little bit about that. But the major problem in education today is that pre-service teachers, for the most part, now we're starting to change to some extent, but most teachers aren't really taught in the science of reading. They're not really taught what science is, how to evaluate it, how to read it, which isn't their job. But they haven't been taught what we've learned through the science of reading to help our kids become competent readers. And that's a major problem, because then they get out into the field and they're like, at least my experience over the last 30 years of doing in-service is that teachers are like, why didn't we learn this when I was in school? I find this very irritating that I didn't learn this. Why? And I'd say in the very beginning, I was more politically correct. And I'd say, well, maybe ask your instructors. But now I just say, because you weren't taught. And that's obviously Louisa Moat started, the letters program because she realized that people weren't being taught. And, we need for those things to happen. So, we want teachers to be the best prepared, and teachers want to be as highly prepared to teach kids how to read. And that's just something we're struggling with. So fact of the matter is, if pre-service teachers were being trained in structured literacy, what the mechanics of reading are, what we need to do to help kids learn how to read, they would have much greater success in helping students become competent readers, and the reading failure rate would plummet. So I think right now it's very, very exciting to be in this space, because we have a lot of people that are listening and paying attention and actually being convinced there's other ways to teach reading than the way that we've been doing it for the last 50 years. And most teachers now are saying, I get it, man. I understand. I agree with you. Teach me how to do it. And that's why I'm excited for Octavia to be here, is because she's a boots on the ground person. She was a kindergarten teacher. She is a first grade teacher. She taught kids how to read. And my guess is before, when she was early on in her career doing these things, she's as confused as many people are today. Like, why isn't this
Absolutely.
easy? They say this is easy. Why isn't it easy? So, yeah,
Ah,
I'm
Dr.
excited.
Hooper.
So, what do you think, Octavia?
I love that you said that because it made me think of the simple view of reading. It is simple, but definitely not easy. And so I think, like most educators, I struggled in the beginning, and then throughout my career, as I went on to eventually be, a campus administrator, district administrator. When I think about the systemic challenges, you are absolutely correct. I think about educator recruitment and retention and preparation and teacher shortages and all of those types of things. And then I also think about some of our outdated policies and like lack of funding, and there are some other things around that. And I think that when it comes to dyslexia, because of that lack of training, we sometimes have under identification or inaccurate identification of our kiddos. We definitely, as you spoke to, have disproven methods of literacy instruction, that thankfully now a lot of that is being, banned as we move on to things that work for all children. And something that I've seen here recently is misidentification of dyslexia for emergent bilinguals. And so when I think about some of the systemic challenges that we face, it still all comes back down to instruction, right? Teaching and learning. So like, what is happening in the classroom and what are we doing that we know that works, not for some kids, but for each and every child in the system. So yes, thank you for sharing that.
Well, I think I'm going to add on to what Octavia said. Really kind of resonated with me. I love the history of special education and the history of special education law. And one of the things that you said, I mean, all of what you said was right on the money, but that lack of funding, ding, that's super important because from 1975, we have, of course, today it's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act since 2004, which is the reauthorization, from 1975. But the Congress, from the very beginning, said we're going to give states 40% of what it costs to educate a child on top of what you're already using to do that. And every year since, they've reneged on that 40%. So right now we're about 13%. And so parents are becoming more aware of their rights that they have, which are dictated and outlined very well in IDEA. And they're going to school systems say, hey, look, you guys are supposed to be doing this stuff. But the school system's like, hey, we're having a hard time getting people to come to be teachers. Teachers' salaries are lower than what they need to be for people as trained as they are. And, the federal government, who's requiring us to do special education, isn't giving us the funding to the tune of 13% of the 40% that they should be giving. So yeah, that lack of funding is a killer, an absolute killer. So, we want to recognize that part of the issue is that, the funding isn't there for us to get all the things accomplished because we ask people to do more and more and more and more in education with less and less and less. And then some people are going, you know what? I could do something else, manual labor, be paid more and it'd be easier.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
Yeah, and one of the challenges I see just in terms of covering the space too is the use of various phrases and semantics, which kind of can add to complications and confusions, as you said, David and Octavia, that can lead to bizarre confrontations in school boards and all the rest of it. But one of the phrases that's out there right now is that the idea of equity. And when we say instructional equity in the headline of our conversation for today, I think that's a hugely important part of the context of what we're talking about in this day and age. So maybe can we talk a little bit about what those definitions are, and what does instructional equity mean to both of you?
Absolutely. Do you want me to take that one?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So when you talk, and you're right, there's so many buzzwords, out there, but when you say equitable instruction, to me, that means that each and every individual child has an opportunity for improved learning outcomes. And that's without regard to race, language, disability, or the demographic area in which they reside. And so it's very, very important that when we talk about effective inclusive instruction for students with dyslexia, that we have to understand their unique learning needs, and we have to empower teachers to employ the teaching strategies that accommodate those needs. So when I think about equitable instruction, I also think about all kids having access to Tier 1 core instruction. So I know that when we talk about dyslexia, we talk about, intervention and acceleration and unfortunately sometimes remediation, which that's something a little bit different that we won't get into right in this moment. But it's very important to understand that we have to really understand culturally responsive instruction, linguistically accommodating instruction. Like, what does that mean? What does it look like? And we have to approach it with an assets-based mindset. And so understanding and believing that what kids come with is an actual strength and not penalizing them for not being on grade level or whatever that might be. And so when I think about equitable instruction and what that looks like, it means meeting every child where they are and giving them what they deserve, it's a civil right, to get to where they need to be.
And so, doctor, does that resonate with you?
Yes, I firmly agree with her on that. And I think before we get, too down the road, I do want to, spend just a minute or two on, the notion of the science of reading, because I really do think it's something that it's become a buzzword.
Yeah.
And when it becomes a buzzword, then people start beating each other with, the buzzwords. And it's like, firstly, what we need to know is that science in general is to help us understand what reality is. And we use a set of rules. I'm a research scientist, so we use a set of rules to make sure their own personal biases don't kind of get infused into our thinking, although they generally do a little bit. We try to extract them as much as possible. And, the science of reading, we refer to it as the science of reading because we've applied science to reading for hundreds of years, but it hasn't been taught. And so, we don't talk about the science of biology because we know biology is a science. We don't talk about the science of physics because we know this physics is a science. We have to use the term science of reading to let people know, hey, what we're talking about here is everything that we know about reading that has been vetted in science. So reading and its sub-skills, phonological processing, phonemic processing, decoding, phonology, phonics, orthography, fluency, vocabulary comprehension, the genetics and neurological basis, the visual perception, all that stuff, everything that we know about reading in terms of science, that's what the science of reading is. That means that we say something about reading, when we talk about the science of reading, that means it's been vetted in science. Like, it's not like, oh, how do I think reading should be taught?
Yes.
It doesn't matter how I think it should be taught. It should be taught based on what science dictates to us should be taught. And so I think everyone in education, pre-service teachers at the bachelor's, master's, doctoral level, if you're going to be a superintendent, a reading specialist, everyone needs to understand about the science of reading, that it's science-based. That's what the science of reading means. And so I think we get off on a limb and say, well, it's science of reading versus something else. It's like, no, everything is in the science of reading. Like, I've heard people say, so now we can't read to kids out loud anymore. No, the science of reading tells us that's a good idea, right? So everything that we've learned through science is really what the science of reading is. And structured literacy is the way that we teach it.
Application.
Based on the science of reading. And yeah, we're going to learn more and more as we go. But right now, we know how to teach kids to be competent readers, period. We don't need to know anymore. It's going to be helpful if we know more, but we're pretty much at the point where we can do those things.
Yeah. And Dr. Herford, I would like to add to that. I love that you clarified that and kind of gave us a level set. But the other thing that makes it equitable is because we know that reading failure can be prevented in all but about 5% of children, right? If with the structured literacy practices, right? And so, like you said, that's over 50 years of research comprised of how we learn to read, why students struggle when they read, and what we can do to mitigate those struggles. So that in itself makes makes everything that you've said, just the fact that it is science, but that in itself also makes it an equitable practice. And it is also applicable to kids of all reading levels. So you do not have to be a struggling reader or a student with dyslexia to benefit from structured literacy instruction.
Exactly. That's a perfect icing on the cake there. Because what we found out by really looking at the science of how to teach struggling readers is that that's the way we should be teaching all kids how to read, because the English writing system is a code, and you got to teach the code first, and then you can teach other things. But you got to tell kids it's a code, because you know, back in the day when Horace Mann said, "Oh, these letters are ugly apparitions and skeletons. They're horrible. Kids hate it." The fact of the matter is, I remember getting the little code in the cereal box, and you get to use the code, right? And then you can write messages in addition to deciphering. That's really exciting for kids. And kindergarten children who
Yes.
are learning the English writing system as a code, that's very exciting for them. And they figure out that there's utility in terms of the more sound letter correspondences, the more words you can decode, synthesize, and read. And like, wow, this is really exciting, right? So I think that's another thing that, Octavia hit on, is that, if we teach all kids based in the science of reading with structured literacy, nearly every kid is going to learn how to read. Even those kids who have intellectual disability will learn how to read. As we do that at our center, we've taught individuals with intellectual disability to learn how to read. And the fact of the matter is, we can prevent kids from experiencing reading failure, even if they have dyslexia in their genetics, right? So if we give them what they need, then that can, obviously help them. So, right. It's great to be on here with someone who's like, it
Yes,
feels
yes.
the same way I do about this, so. But that's why, when you've been in the trenches and you've tried to work with kids who are struggling readers, and you're like, I figured it out now. These are the things that work. I want to spread it out there so that other teachers get to do this. I mean, that's kind of what our mission is today, is to help people know that there's solutions for whatever issues that are out there. Either there are solutions or we'll help you figure them out, because
Mhm.
that's what science wants to do, is figure it out.
And I love that you said that you've seen it happen, and that's the work that you do, because I think a big issue is trying to bridge that theory, the research and theory, to practice. So it's like, yes, I know this, I'm aware, I've got it, but like, how do you implement that? And how do you ensure that it has the intended impact? I think that we're all moving in that direction. But so often it's like, okay, even with that, sometimes you don't know what you don't know. And as you're going down that path on the science of reading journey, it can be a little bit complicated. And so I think it's also good to have these conversations for those of you who are out there, not just to listen to us, but like in your schools and in your systems and in your district. And so when you think about and engage in that sense making of, yes, I understand this, but what does that actually look like when we talk about skillful fidelity to structured literacy practices that actually, I was going to say move the needle, but I read something the other day that said it's time for us to move mountains and not needles. But so I think that's so important, Dr. Herford. So thank you.
Yeah.
And I would like to kind of ask, just kind of being the conduit for the audience here. And these are great insights and great from a big picture perspective. Could each of you, though, give us what that looks like in the day-to-day, boots on the ground in the classroom, and maybe starting with you, Octavia, specifically within that context of equity? I mean, is there an example that you can give of maybe something that's going on right now that would be, something that needs to be improved upon when it comes to like an inequitable practice?
Well, that's a loaded question. So in terms of instructional practices, I think that way too often, if I go to 12 different campuses on 12, I can go to 12 different campuses on the same day, and I can ask 12 different people, like, so tell me how you do literacy here, and I will receive 12 different answers. And so there isn't one concrete way, or not everyone is on the same page about what that looks like. What does good instruction look like? And so when I think about a structured literacy approach, I'm talking about a program that explicitly teaches phonemic awareness and phonics, vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension skills in a systematic and cumulative manner. And so, and also multisensory instruction. And so there's so many different ways, but I think the most important thing or disparity that I see is that we don't really have a way of making sure that we're all on the same page and rowing in the same direction, if that makes sense, in terms of, so even for districts who are entrenched in, the science of reading, and we're moving forward and we're doing this, I'm not exactly sure if they've made a decision on like, what does their literacy framework look like, or what does their instructional block look like, or what high quality instructional materials will they be using? How will they, identify and move forward with those students that are struggling? How will they monitor those processes? And so really the thing that makes it not equitable is that it's not something that's in place and that can be measured and monitored, right? And so we're just kind of doing different hodgepodge things here and there. And so it's not just inequitable for students who are dyslexic, but really for all students. And so that is, I know that's a roundabout way, but it's just not being on the same page and everyone rowing in the same direction. And so there's so many I've gone to places where they still say, well, I can mix a little bit of balanced literacy with, I can take this piece and that piece because, I like this piece, but I don't like that piece. And so being really clear and intentional about what that looks like, I think is key.
So like a standardized construct, like a codified construct that would go like throughout the district. So there aren't ups and downs, considering, and obviously challenges with that, right? Because
yes. When you said that, I was like, like, so no, there is no one size fits all, but you definitely, so you have to have some absolutes, right?
Yeah.
And you have to kind of decide, because if everything's important, nothing's important, right?
Yep.
So you have to decide what it is that you're going to focus on, and you have to have the criteria in place, and you have to empower teachers to make instructional decisions. You can't just dictate and say, this is what it looks like, right? Because every classroom looks different, every child looks different, and you have to give them, empower them to be able to support and teach in the way that works for the students. At the same time, that doesn't mean that I can go to Teachers Pay Teachers and get this because it works for me, and someone else can use this, and someone else can use that, and someone else can use that. So
Right.
you have to be very clear about what the criteria is, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. And then you have to have ongoing, like a cycle of continuous improvement. It's not a one and done. I think people think, you know what, we implemented this, we're great, we're going to move on. We're now science of reading people. No, it doesn't look like that.
Right.
Every day you are revisiting that, you are refining it, you are making changes, you are shifting, you are pivoting, you are doing all of those different things. And so that's what makes it so complex. And I think that's what makes it overwhelming for people.
Yeah.
And it's okay. It's supposed to be hard. It's messy. It's complicated, but it's worth it.
Yeah.
And once you get those pieces in place, and you like I said, and you get everyone rowing in the same direction, then at least you have some things in place that will help people employ equitable practices within that. But it's not just a like, here's a checklist, and so go do this and then you're good. It's not that.
So the phrase personalized learning has entered the webinar here, it sounds like to me.
Well,
Doctor, any thoughts?
The fact of the matter is, when we're talking about science of reading and structural literacy, if you take a look at what structural literacy is suggesting that you should be teaching, that's what people should be teaching. Now, we got on this notion in the 1960s that we want kids to acquire reading like they acquire speech. Well, speech is firmware that for nearly every kid that's born is built into their brain. So they come out and they start mumbling around and saying, Mama, Dada, you're like, oh yeah, Mama, Dada, right, we like that. So we're reinforcing them for that. And then, they acquire speech in a natural setting. I mean, it's just naturally progressing because they have that firmware in their brain. But reading is not like that. Reading, in fact, neuroscientists refer to reading as neurological recycling, because we're asking individuals to use parts of their brains that were built for something else. Where language acquisition, it was built for that, so it just acquires naturally. So in the 1960s, and actually even before then, we thought, well, it'd be really great if kids could learn how to read that way. It would be. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
And so this notion of, what we refer to as the 3 cueing system, guess at words, and quite literally, the theory is referred to as a guessing game. So in reality, guessing at words is a terrible way to teach reading. If you're reading a book and every page of it says the dog is, and then the next page, there's a picture of what the dog's doing, that kid's not reading. The kid is just telling you a story based on the pictures. Yep. And so if you look at pictures to kind of, teach kids how to read, or if you say, hey, what was the sentence right before that about? Can you tell me? Maybe that'll help you figure out the word. Or try to decode the first part of it and guess the rest of it. That's absolutely unequivocally, and I'm just going to say it out the way it is in terms of science, that's the wrong way to teach reading. Will some kids learn how to read that way? Sure, probably about 20% of kids, whatever way you want to teach them to read, they're going to get it. But right now in the United States, we have 39% of our children who are reading below the basic level. And the basic level is a rudimentary ability to read. So reading below the basic level means you're essentially not reading. We have nearly 40% of our kids. And if you look at kids of color and Hispanic children, we're looking at 62 and 60%. That's terrible. So when you're talking about equity, that's not it. That is not equitable. So when we teach kids the structured literacy approach and teach them, look, this is a code and this is how we use the code, and then we bring other things into it along with it. Yes, I mean, there was an article a couple of months ago that came out and said, look, if we teach kids decoding, see, they still don't know how to read. And they said, they're giving this example of a child who decoded the word after. And they said they decoded into Okay, that's not decoding after. So even in that particular article, they're showing their ignorance in terms of the lack of knowledge of science, because after has an R-controlled vowel in there, ER, right? That's phoneme in itself. So when we don't know these things and we don't teach it, kids don't learn it, and we have kids who are struggling. So equity involves teaching reading the way it should be taught, so kids understand that it's a code, that you can use it to decode and read, that you can then encode to spell and to write, that you have to reduce reading and spelling and writing as reciprocal processes from the very beginning so they get it. Yes, it's complicated, but do we want kids to learn how to read, or do we want it to be easy? And the answer for the last 50 years, it's been, let's do it easy, because it's easy to teach teachers how to do that. It's wrong, but it's easy. Imagine you're a piano teacher and you say to a kid, hey, here's the sheet music on the piano. Guess at it. What's going to happen? They're not going to learn how to play piano. Right. We got to teach them that the letters represent the sounds and how we decode it. And granted, the English writing system is a bit more complicated than others, but there's still plenty of it that is predictable and easy for the kids to kind of figure out. And then we just build on those things. But, it's really important, we talk about equitable, that, kids who have dyslexia or have reading difficulties, that we give them precisely the notion of how to teach that reading to them. But in addition, the benefit is that we teach all kids that they all benefit. Even the kids who would get it anyway, they become better spellers, better writers. So yeah, that's important. I mean, yes, we have to deal with every single child out there at his or her level, no doubt about that. But if we start in kindergarten teaching the science of reading, structured literacy to them, you know what you're going to find? Fewer kids are going to struggle.
We got some questions coming in from the audience here, which I think is a pretty good segue with what you just mentioned, Dr. Herford, about your perspective. For this one audience member is what they and their organization has held for over 25 years. So they're asking, what can you do? What can we do to hold colleges of education and alternative certification programs accountable for teaching and preparing those teachers in the science of reading, amongst other things?
That's a huge challenge, because right now we have parents who've been screaming since 2011, and even before then. The Decoding Dyslexia group started in 2011. And a year and a half after they started, 4 or 5 parents in New Jersey, there are 47 states and 2 provinces in Canada. So it resonated with parents. They're like, yeah, we want our kids to learn how to read. How do we do that? Parents want this to happen. Teachers are desperate to learn how to teach reading properly. There's unequivocally no doubt about that. Legislators want it to happen. Everybody on the planet wants it to happen. The holdout has been colleges of education, who have not been all that interested in learning about the science of reading. And that's why, if people said to me, hey, you're in charge of education now, what would it look like from the bachelor's level all the way up to the doctoral level? There'd be a heavy infusion of how you understand science. In psychology, we train scientist practitioners, because when people get out and are practitioners, we want them to be reading the scientific literature so they're not bamboozled into doing something that's not going to be appropriate. But that happens, unfortunately, in education, because we don't teach the science piece of it, right? And so I'm going to answer very specifically that question. In Kansas, this is how we solved it. We created Senate Bill 438. Check it out, Senate Bill 438. What that does, it says you will no longer teach anything that's not based in science in colleges of education. That's gone. If it's not based in science, you don't get to teach it. And people are screaming, what about academic freedom? You don't have academic freedom to teach the non-science-based material. I mean, academic freedom and tenure came about because we wanted people to actually teach based on science, not to come up with ideas that weren't based in science. And we wanted to protect those people, even if society didn't like what they were saying about the science, right? So if you look at Senate Bill 438, you'll see that they have to teach the science of reading. They are no longer allowed to teach the 3 cueing system in any shape or form, balanced literacy, Calkins, Fontenay-Pentel, whatever way you want to look at it. Those methods do not work. How do we know that? 40% of our nation's kids can't read. That's how we know that. And you look at kids who aren't white kids, it hurts them even more. So when you talk about equitable teaching, sorry, I'm getting excited here. But if you want to talk about equity, you got to teach what we know is true based in science. And so the 3 cueing system in all shape or form is outlawed in Kansas. You no longer get to do that. Yes. We're creating centers of excellence for parents to go to get their kids evaluated, to get extra help, to infuse professionals into the school system, to help teachers are saying, hey, I get it. I told you I get it. Teach me how to do it. I want Octavia in my classroom to show me how to do it.
And I am in Kansas. What a coincidence. So no, because I am a graduate teaching fellow for the College of Education in K-State. And I supervise and support pre-service teachers going into the classroom. And so as they are making that shift, it's been very interesting to see how it's there and they want it, but there are so many pieces that still need to be put in place, right? Easier said than done. So the most important thing is, like you said, it is now the law. And so it has to take place. But I think in order to get those systems up and going, there's a lot of things, don't you think, that have to be replaced? There's a lot of outdated things. So even though when we say, okay, here's the way it should be done, how are we providing the tools and the resources and the experiences? If I am a pre-service teacher going into a classroom to get my hours, and the teacher's classroom that I'm going into, I know more about the science of reading than she does. We have had some very interesting conversations, about how to approach that. So I think it's a beautiful thing. It is complicated, but I think it's great. And eventually everyone's just going to have to get on board, right? And so I call what we have now kind of this coalition of the willing, but I totally agree with you. Is there an option when we talk about equity and kids not being able to read? And when we say, oh, this is hard for adults and this is hard for them and they have to make the shift, well, you know that nothing is more difficult than not being able to read. So it's a priority.
A few more questions coming in, which I think is great and shows how engaged everybody is, and the ideas and insights here. It's just overflowing. But one thing I find interesting is the aspect from the parent side. The question, a basic question about dyslexia. Number one, what are signs of dyslexia that parents or guardians can look for in a student? What are those basic signs that are found there? And the second question came in from actually someone who's a member of a school board who says that they receive a lot of parent complaints saying that their child was diagnosed with dyslexia and their division refuses to acknowledge or recognize that diagnosis for an IEP. Parents are saying that they are having to pay thousands of dollars to seek outside professionals just to get a proper diagnosis. The attendee can't wrap their brain around why their district refuses to accept dyslexia as a diagnosis and why they refuse to provide these children what they need to succeed. Any thoughts there? That's a whole webinar right in itself, but I'll toss it to you anyway.
It's definitely a whole webinar in itself, but it's a complicated answer, and it really goes back to what Octavia said earlier and what I jumped on in terms of, the Congress has mandated all these things to happen with special education and school systems, right? And parents are becoming more savvy about what that is. But the second part of it is they haven't come through with the funding. So here we have school systems who are scrambling around trying to get all the personnel they can. I mean, in Kansas, we've got some school systems that have a very large percentage of people who are not really certified teachers. Across the United States, there are 9% of our teachers in classrooms right now who are not, they're emergency certified teachers. So it's complicated in that we're asking school systems to do things that they really don't have the ability to come through on. And then even more complicated, and I don't think parents and school systems necessarily understand this, but the IEP team is who determines if someone's going to get special education or not. I can say that a child has dyslexia and send our evaluation report, because we do evaluations here at our center, and I can send a letter along with that and say, this child definitely has dyslexia. And the IEP team can either accept that or not accept it. Most of the time they do. But then on top of that, they also have to make a decision. Okay, a child has dyslexia, and in reality, there's a spectrum of dyslexia. There's some individuals who can't read at all, and there's many barriers for them getting access to reading. And then there's some individuals who are slower readers that they've actually learned how to decode and do these things. So there's a spectrum. So then the next question is, okay, the child has dyslexia, then do they require special education, which modification of their curriculum to be successful in the classroom? Or would it be better for them to have a 504 plan that would give them accommodations? Like you said, it's a whole different webinar, but yeah, there's answers to those questions. And then in reality, even determining if a child has dyslexia, there's lots of things that can be done there too. But I'll give Octavia a chance to say something here too.
No, I'm taking all of that in, and I'm also reflecting back. And so for this school board member, I feel your pain because there are so many different moving parts. And even when we talk about Dr. Herford, like kindergarten and first grade and how important that is, sometimes in school districts, even though you and I know early detection is best, they will say, well, let's not identify them till they get to third grade or fourth grade. And I've even had kids slip through the cracks until high school. And so then the parents are like, no, I know that something is not quite right. But there may be some other things in there where they say, well, this is maybe not developmentally appropriate. And, we're not really sure. And then even if you are to be tested by a third party, you're absolutely right. Depending on what the policy is for that particular district, they still have to go through that process, whether it be for 504 or SPED or whatever that is. And then sometimes the waiting list, you may have 50 kids on the waiting list before you even get to that child. So that system is definitely broken. And so when that happens, who is communicating with the parents? Who's communicating with the teachers? Who is communicating and letting them know that we see you and we understand that this is a priority and it is urgent, but this is where we are in this process. So there's so many different things, about that and how I've seen that system work. And I can understand, because as a parent, that's very frustrating. But I think there is just a lack of communication and understanding in terms what we know should be done versus what can be done in that space within the school system, and when all the cogs are not moving at the same time in the right direction and all of that. And so you're right, that's a webinar in itself, but definitely it's something that need to be explored, and then those conversations had with parents, and to come alongside as partners. Because a lot of time it does feel kind of contentious. It's like, okay, the school is not helping me, but the school wants as much for your child as you do, and just not understanding what that process looks like. And then you go to a third party person and they're like, no, we absolutely know this. And then you go back. And so it's a very complex thing. But for me, the best thing is just communication and transparency. If you are transparent about that, and even to have the discussion. So although your child may not be labeled in this way, because we are a district or a classroom or a school who uses structured literacy practices, this is how we can help your child or all children or whatever. So there's just also a matter of that communication to help to bridge that gap and to make sure that you are employing instructional strategies that help all kids. So that kind of helps with that equity piece. And then also for those students who are struggling that may not be diagnosed yet, you're helping them without knowing you're helping them. So
Right.
That's a good point. I saw someone flash a little message across the screen, so I wanted to kind of discuss that because it's really appropriate for the conversation. Because there are school systems that use response to intervention or MTSS approaches.
Yes.
And what they do, for those of you not really familiar with that, is if a child is having difficulty, they get they start being evaluated, and they give them the different approaches, and if that's not working, they do something else. Response to intervention, which is basically what we always do in schools anyway, right? A teacher's like, I want to get the kid from A to B. How do I do that? So it's kind of consistent with, I think when RTI first came out, teachers were like, oh my gosh, another crazy thing. It's like, you've already been doing this. You got this, right? It's just a more formalized approach. But one of the things I want to say about MTSS, because people have said in the last few years that MTSS RTA doesn't work. The only time it doesn't work is when you don't give the appropriate intervention. I mean, that's the only problem, right? So
true.
If you haven't given the appropriate intervention, then yes, it's not going to work. And that's why you change your interventions based on the kind of data you're getting back from the students. So that was a really good comment. I mean, we only have so much stuff we can cover, but I'm glad I saw that one, because I feel like Octavia and I are tag teaming pretty well, but that was when it's like, oh yeah, we better say something about that.
Well, one of the numbers that you keep bringing up, which is quite frankly, frightening, is that 40% and the lack of reading. And so, and again, probably as a result of the pandemic and other things over the past few years, that's only has been exacerbated because of that situation. But we're getting a couple questions in about how to work with that. So maybe that students that are kind of beyond the pale, do we start back at the beginning and we go, what do we do? How do we approach that? Here's one specifically. We have one new to the U.S. student entering 7th grade. It's testing at a 2nd grade reading level.
Wow.
He does have an IEP, but growth at his prior school had been so slow and non-existent. They're determined to meet his needs and help him grow into a strong reader. Do you recommend going back to square one, reviewing all of the K1 and 2 foundational reading skills, or starting where he's at? And how do we best support him in a 7th grade general education classroom? I mean, I think that one anecdotal example is one that is replicated many times over, right?
Dr. Herford, I'm going to let you take this one, but I have to say something first because this really speaks to my heart. So 2 things. Just because a child doesn't read well doesn't mean they don't think well. Okay. And so when we think about expressive and receptive, language and processes and reading, writing, listening, and speaking, I mean, of course, obviously, I'd have to know more about this child. But the other thing I want to say, too, is about repaving the entire highway versus having a diagnosis. When I think about Scarborough's rope, and I think about all the many different sub skills that are combined so that we can become skilled. And if one of those strands is weak, of course, it weakens the entire rope, and of course, the reader. But if you just go back and reteach every single thing from 1st and 2nd grade all the way to 7th grade, that is what we call remediation. What this child needs is acceleration, meaning you find the potholes. You don't repave the entire highway. You find the potholes and you figure out what that is. It's not that easy, I understand, but there's not enough time left or in a day or in a year to go back and try to reteach everything. And you are assuming that because he's reading at a 2nd grade level that he doesn't know things beyond. And so when we say levels, I feel like level readers lead to leveled lives. That's a whole nother thing. And so when we just teach a child to decode and encode and do all of those things, we are basically unlocking literacy for them. And so so those are the first 2 things that I want to say. So like, please do not go all the way back with the 7th grade child and try to teach them everything from 2nd grade up till now. And there has to be some other, he obviously, or he or she needs some strong intervention, but not remediation, and understanding the difference of what that is. And we are creating gaps for that child if we don't allow them access to 7th grade material. And however we can accommodate or allow access to that, that is our jobs, to make sure that we can help them enter into that space, however that is. And Dr. Herford, I'm going to let you take it from here, but I just wanted to put that plea out there. So.
No, that was awesome. That was great. I would say the same. I would say the same thing. I would want to make sure, like when we're talking about children like this person, this person is the first language, is it is it English language issues? Can they read in their previous, there's lots of questions to be asked here, but Octavia really jumped on something that I think is extremely important. And that is, we don't want to limit access to information because of inability to read.
Yes.
And so I'm a huge proponent of assistive technologies that allow students to gain access while we're teaching them how to read.
Yes.
Both at the same time. So yeah, I think that's incredibly important. And I'll give another example. I have a friend who is at a high school. She's the dyslexia person in her high school. And several years ago, many of the kids she deals with all the dyslexia kids, right? So many of the kids were getting C's and D's on their exams. And so she went to the instructor and said, I'm not asking you to give them more time. If you let them come to their homeroom, I'll give them the exam exactly the same way that you'd give it to them, but I'll allow them extra time, like time and a half. So rather than this being a test of reading, which we already know they have poor reading skills, it becomes more of a test of what they know.
Yes.
And what happened is those C's and D's went up to B's and A's.
Yep.
And that's why it's critically important, I think, for parents, even if we may not even have the ACT or the SATs, in a few years from now, but getting an IEP or a 504 plan now, before they are going to have to take those tests, if they have to take those tests, ETS will allow those kids to almost automatically get accommodations. Yeah. And you want that because you want this to be a test of their knowledge, not of their reading
Yes.
ability, because we already know they're, even if they become what I call competent readers, where they're capable of comprehending what they're reading, they're slower, right?
Mhm.
So if anything that's time then becomes a constraint for them and a constraint of what they're able to tell. But I agree totally with Octavia's. I would want to make absolutely sure they knew the decoding piece, that they
Yes.
knew all of the sound letter correspondences, because there's quite a few digraphs and some trigraphs and some tricky stuff out there that, we don't want to assume they know them. But then we don't want to reteach stuff that, like, I get that, man. What are you doing? So we don't want to bore them out of oblivion, right? So, but right, I really have nothing else to say other than what I just said. I think when she said, let me say a couple things, I'm like, you just nailed it. What are we talking about? So,
Well, and I knew that the toughest part of my job this afternoon was going to be to end the conversation. There are so many various ways we can go. Already gathered so many ideas and insights, and as I said, I think we have a whole schedule of events going forward where we can go down various rabbit holes. But as we bring our conversation to a close, I'd like to ask each of you to share kind of one final piece of advice or insight or inspiration for the educators here in the audience. We talked a lot about the challenges, and I mean, there's no sugarcoating it. I mean, this is a challenging time to be an educator. So maybe what is a message that you could share about supporting students with dyslexia and advancing instructional equity that you could leave with everybody today? I'll put
I
you on the
think
hot seat first, David.
I'll just jump in first then. And I would say, when I'm a research scientist, like I said, and back in the mid 1980s, Octavia were even born then, I'm not even sure, but
I was.
okay. All right, good. Yeah, sometimes I give references in class and like, I don't even know what you're talking about, but I think what's important is that, first we're looking at kids who have reading difficulties. We didn't really say dyslexia or not dyslexia. And I think what we've learned by looking at kids who have dyslexia is that we can teach the majority of kids how to read. So for me, it's become less of a dyslexia issue and more of a reading issue, a reading crisis. We can help all kids, whether they have dyslexia or not. Personally, it doesn't really change a lot of the way we do business here. And I think we're going to learn more through science, but I think it's important for people to know where we are right now. We know how to help kids become competent readers, and we're getting more and more people on the same page. I think part of the history of it is that the science has been there for decades. Then we had Decoding Dyslexias, picking up the banner and saying, hey, come on, guys, let's do something. Let's talk. No Child Left Behind didn't get this to happen, even though we were close. And then with Emily Hanford sold a story in the way that she's articulated, not blame people, she's gotten teachers thinking, are there ways to teach that I haven't thought of? And oh my gosh, I think we're in a place right now we can take advantage of all the goodwill we have towards reading and make a significantly important difference and keep maintaining it. Granted, we got a lot of work to do and to implement those things, but I'm excited to be towards the end of my career and actually to see something for real going to happen. Because for 40 years, basically people have been telling me, go back to your office, Davey. We don't want to hear about that science stuff. And, it truly, that's, how we've determined how to identify kids, how to evaluate them, what to do for intervention, remediation, and what to do to prevent reading failure in the first place. So I'm pretty excited. So
Great, thank you. And Octavia, we'll leave you with the last word.
What he said, like all of that. But literacy changes lives. Literacy changes lives. It unlocks the door to all lifelong, life-wide, life-deep learning. Do not cheat our kids of that. So that's it.
right on, right on.
That's the way to end it, Octavia. I have to say, I'd like to thank you and David for a really fascinating and heartening conversation, and to hear that there are strategies out there and that there are solutions for our students, is at the end an uplifting thing, even as many of the challenges that are out there. So I'd also like to thank our audience for so many great questions and
Yes.
comments that came in. But there's nothing more to a testament to a valuable conversation than when people are out there on Zoom, linking in and participating. And I think I'll go out there and say that any of the questions that were not answered during the course of this conversation, there'll be some follow-up there. So with that, as a reminder, you'll get an email within the next few days that contains a link to this recording along with the slides. Thanks again for participating, and have a great day.